I have to confess, ladies and gentlemen, sitting at the desk like this, with my microphone on and my notes in front of me, I feel like I should be reading the 9 o'clock news. A very, very warm welcome to all of you this morning here for closing the raw materials loop, how recycling can help secure Europe's low-carbon future. Clearly, we talk about news, and I'm sure we've all seen the news relevant to this title in the last few days or weeks. You don't need me to tell you that we've had the IPCC report, 1.5 degrees, on the carbon future of Europe, very relevant, of course. We've also had the 1-year anniversary of the EU's battery alliance, only a few days ago, in fact, relevant also for our debate today. And of course, it goes without saying, and I say as a British person myself, we also have Brexit on the agenda as well, don't we? And I recognise a few faces in the room from the last event I did with Eurometaux, which was indeed on Brexit. Now, let me show you what's in store today, what we've planned to make best of your time and use you as an audience as a resource for these debates as well. So take a look at the slides behind me there. You can see that our morning up to lunchtime is going to be in 5 steps, ladies and gentlemen. In a moment, not long from now, I'll be handing over to Ronald from Norsk Hydro, who will be giving us a big picture to start us off on the issues that we've been focusing on, batteries and closing the gap in circularity. Then we'll be joined remotely by Vice President Šefčovič, who unfortunately, due to scheduling, couldn't be with us in person, but he's very kindly produced a video for us, which I'll be sharing with you, where he makes some very interesting points about climate commitment, about circularity, and also on our first panel's theme of batteries, an essential role in enabling a low-carbon future. I think of great interest to everybody in the room, particularly those of the non-ferrous metals industry. Then we'll move into that panel on batteries, and following that panel, we'll give you a break. After the break, we'll look at the more, can we say, policy rather than application-related part of our proceedings today, about aligning circular and low-carbon policy agendas. We're all familiar with the circular economy. We're all familiar with the low-carbon targets. We're all familiar with the draft leak report from the Commission that came out not so long ago, or was available for some to see. But obviously there's a need for alignment there between these different policy areas, and a risk, if we're not careful, of a degree of siloism, which doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help for a decarbonised Europe. It doesn't facilitate a competitive non-ferrous metals industry in Europe, with its production in Europe. And then we'll have our closing reflections to finish us off for lunch from Janez Potočnik, as many as you know, a former climate commissioner, and he'll be sharing his views on the proceedings and making some challenging comments about next steps. But I've told you what the speakers and panelists are going to be doing. Let me now tell you, ladies and gentlemen, what I expect from you. That sounds a bit school teacherish, I know. I am actually a science teacher as well. But you've got a pretty important role to play here. Sorry we had to choose an American image. I know Trump's not very popular at the moment. But we do actually want your input. I know people say this all the time at events like this. But genuinely, it's going to be central today to the debate. Instead of the panel speaking and you following, you're going to be leading the panel in the sense that you're going to tell them what you want them to talk about. And to do that, you're going to use Slido. Raise a hand if you're familiar with the Slido tool here in the room. Okay, some of you. Okay. Can I pick one of you to come here and explain it to everybody else, please? No. I joke. Right, on the screen there, you can see with Slido, we're going to use it in a moment to do a little test with you all so you can log in. But to do so, you need your smartphone. Can you hold up your smartphones, ladies and gentlemen? Show them to me, please. Just hold them up. Make sure we've all got one. Right, when you finish the conference today, there'll be a box by the door where you can recycle it, okay? Okay, wonderful. We'll do a login to Slido in just a moment. You also note on the slide here, for those of you that are the Twitterati as well, you've got our hashtag for today, which is circular CO2. So feel free to share your views, pose your points with that hashtag. Now, I'd also like to turn to my left here, Floris, and introduce to you Floris Udshorn, who's our cartoonist today. Could we have an immediate round of applause for him, please? Some of you may already be familiar with Floris, and I know some of you are. And he'll be live cartooning today to capture some of the key points of our discussions, and I'll be calling on him occasionally to show those to us as well, and they'll be rolling in the breaks for you to have a look at too. So let me come in now, and let's do this Slido test. Now, I mentioned the news before, the IPCC report, the Battery Alliance anniversary, and I've got to say also Brexit. Let's be honest, it's there, you know. I'm just going to go on to this. I want to take you back 2 years when we were in another Eurometaux event 2 years ago, if you look on the left. And on Twitter, we were trending ahead of Theresa May during a European summit focused on Brexit. What an odd coincidence that Theresa May's just been here in Brussels for another summit. Yeah? But look on the right, we can see obviously an issue. Yeah? I hate to see my country trending in this way, but it seems to be. So in the news at the moment, we've got a lot of things that impact your industry. But our focus today is not on Brexit. Our focus today is purely going to be on applications in terms of batteries and bridging that gap that I mentioned before. So let me take you back now to Slido. So take those phones out again now, please. And your instructions are there. Step 1, go to this address on your browser. Step 2, insert your code, circular CO2. And then we'll try a poll. I'll give you a few seconds for everybody to log in, of course. Right, I'm guessing if you're logging in, you've logged in by now, and this is our test question that you've seen. We'll take the safe, easy one of Brexit. How is it going to end? Very badly, but mainly for the UK. Very badly for both sides. Could we keep our poll up, please? Thank you. I don't know, or very well for both sides, which is not very popular at the moment. Right, I think most of our voters have voted by now, and that's good. We've got a little bit of movement going on. Let's see what we've got then. It seems that we're all of a similar, half of us at least are of a similar vein, that we feel that Brexit's not trending in the right way. We see mutual loss on both sides, and some of us are not sure. I've got to be honest with you, I'm in the not sure category myself at the moment. I'm waiting for further developments. But again, let me make the link. 2 things then. So Slido's up and running, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be using it regularly today. So now you're logged in, you can stay in. And the second point I want to make is Brexit may be uncertain, but our other 2 topics today are not. We have a clear battery action plan. We have clear circular economy policies and decarbonisation policies. So the next step and our focus now then is on how we can move those forward. And with that in mind, I think we should get straight down to things. Are they still moving? Oh, only a little bit. Great. So, as I mentioned, there are 5 steps today, and our first step is to get a big picture of where we are with the broad issues that I've touched upon. So, with that in mind, I'd like to call up to the stage now Ronald Misterud, the Vice President, Head of EU Affairs at Norsk Hydro. Please, Ronald, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to talk about Brexit. I will talk a bit about Hydro, and I will talk a bit about aluminium, and I will talk about non-ferrous metals. When I started in Hydro in 1998, I came from a much colder environment, doing field work at the glacier at Spitsbergen. At that time, in 1998, we produced a lot of aluminium, and I think we did a good job. I believe we did a good job. We did also recycling. Where is the pointer? Sorry. Okay, now I've learned the machine. We did also recycling in 98. Hydro is present in the whole value chain with our bauxite mine in Brazil, alumina refinery in Brazil, and in energy, where I have spent 18 years of my time in Hydro, in primary production, cast houses, and a wide range of products, which we recycle again and again and again. Today in Hydro, we have reduced CO2 emissions by 70% since '98. And recycling has developed to be a crucial part of Europe's transition to a low-carbon economy. We are actually very good at what we are doing today in our industry. We produce metal in a very efficient way, and we recycle more and more metal. These two elements are key to decarbonizing in Europe. It's important to remember that we need both these two elements, efficient production and recycling. And we need a framework where we can invest in these operations. I want to show a few examples from Hydro on how we can contribute to the low-carbon transition. My first example comes from primary production. Last year, we invested in a new technology smelter in Norway, the Karmøy Technology Pilot. And as this is electro-intensive production, energy efficiency has been core focus in all years. And this technology developed over many years of research is 15% more energy and climate efficient than the world average. We got investment support from an innovation fund in Norway to do this investment. But in order to deploy this technology in Europe, we need framework conditions to do these investments. We need improved framework for compensation for CO2, because we need to compete in the global aluminium market. These are my colleagues at the new plant at Karmøy. My next example comes from the product side. Starting with mobility. An average car in Europe uses 151 kilos of lightweight aluminium. Projections show that aluminium content could go to 200 kilos in 2025, and that would reduce emissions by 16 grams per kilometer. And that is a significant reduction. Buildings and renewables. In buildings, efficient buildings will reduce emissions, and we can even have power-positive buildings, as our building in Bellenberg in Germany. Like other metals presented here today, aluminium is a key element in the European transition to a low-carbon power system. And there is a strong demand for metals into windmills, solar panels, and transmission lines, etc. So, and what we do when we do our investment in Hydro, we always calculate the carbon footprint. And this is a very important guiding. Also the carbon footprint from the use phase. This is also important guiding for our investments. My third and last example comes from recycling. Our metals are permanent materials that can be recycled again and again and again. And the energy consumption to recycle is only 5% of the energy used in the primary production. And last year we launched a product called 75R, actually, Hydro 75R, and it consists of minimum 75% recycled post-consumed scrap. And we are sold out. Aluminium has a high durability. It takes a long time before it comes back to, sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes it takes a short time. But for example, from buildings tend to last for 50 years. So from that, we are actually recycling metals from the 60s. So there is a limitation of how much metals we can get back, but we are trying to get as much back as possible. So our low carbon contribution consists of these 3 layers. Sorry. Efficient production, enabling products, and maximizing of recycling. As President Emmanuel Macron said, there is no planet B. So we really have to get planet A right. And this is what we can do as companies, non-ferrous metal companies, by focusing on efficient production, producing enabling products, and maximizing on recycling. That is our pathway to a sustainable planet A. We have a lot of common in our industry. Europe's low-carbon transition will dramatically increase the demand for our metals. And clean mobility is a very good example. I've already mentioned the use of aluminium for lightweighting. And our allies are lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and lead in batteries, copper in the electronic wirings and motors, zinc in the galvanized steel, and metals, platinum, palladium, and rhodium in the catalytic converter. The majority of these metals will be recycled at the end of life, as long as old vehicles are recycled properly. But today, 3 to 4 million end-of-life vehicles go missing each year. 1/3 of all available vehicles don't get recycled through proper channels. And we lose access to thousands of kilo non-ferrous metals that we could reuse in Europe. Therefore, a proper circular economy policy are needed to improve collections and sorting. The demand for non-ferrous metals in the low-carbon transition extends also to renewable technologies, as mentioned. Last year, the World Bank forecasted globally by 2050 that we will need 300% more metal for the windmills, 200% more metal for the solar panels, and 1,000% more metals for the batteries. As a society, we must make sure that we do not couple this with increased greenhouse gas emissions. So, recycling is one route to meet the growing demand. A bigger share of metals will be recycled in the future. We are investing in new technology and new capacity to recycle. But recycle will not be enough on its own. This projection from the Circular Economy report launched earlier this year show that in 2050, primary production of aluminium will cover about 50% of the need. And this is globally. But Europe should not be dependent only on import of primary production of aluminium. That would not make sense, actually, because Europe is developing a cleaner and cleaner power mix, so it really makes sense to have primary production in Europe. And then it's again, and also really important to remember, because of this strong demand from climate policy-driven demand, we need 150% more aluminium in 2050 compared with 2015. And this is a circular scenario, even more recycled capacity than in the baseline scenario, but still 50% from primary. So what we need? Gradually decarbonize primary supply, and we need improved aluminium circularity, and this has to go hand in hand. So what policy does Europe have in place? Our industry believes that EU has a big potential in integrating the 2050 low carbon policy and its circular economy agenda. The metals industry has robust decarbonizing pathways, And in the framework conditions, if the framework conditions are right, we will be able to compete globally, and we will continue to invest. We need a meaningful integration of these policies. So, our industry has changed a lot since '98 when I started, and we are ready for high ambitions in Europe for the next 20 to 30 years. We call on two essential things from EU policymakers: an integrated 2050 strategy which recognizes the complementary nature of primary and secondary production, with its need for predictable framework conditions to invest in Europe and compete globally. And we also need an ambitious circular economy action plan which prioritizes actions to secure strategic raw material supply. A well-thought-out integration of low-carbon and circular economy policy will initiate new investments and will allow Europe to succeed in its own low-carbon transition. Thank you.
And thank you for giving us your views and giving us the picture. The practical question, click us here. Thank you very much. So we've heard then the need for this connection of policy, not silos, but a need to make stronger synergy between them. I took away three big things, Ronald, from what you've told us there. That decarbonising primary metal production has to go hand in hand with better circularity, first of all. That recycling on its own is not enough, but it will provide us with better strategic supply in Europe if we do it well. And more, your last point, that a well-thought-out and meaningful integration of circular economy and low carbon is essential if we want to move forward. So we've heard our views then from a metals industry perspective and also a Norsk Hydro perspective. And you've touched upon your ask at the end to EU policymakers. Let's now switch to the EU policymaker point of view. And as I mentioned now, we'll hear from Vice President Šefčovič. So let's hear what he's got to say to welcome us and his opening comments.
Dear Renug, dear participants of the Closing the Raw Material Loop conference, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by praising Eurometaux for taking this initiative. We are at a critical juncture. Let's look at the figures ahead of us. Global population is expected to increase by some 20% at the mid-century. Overall resource use could double between 2010 and 2030, and urbanization is a main driver of industrial mineral and base metal consumption. This means that in 30 years' time, global metals extraction and biomass production will need to increase by at least 50%, and non-metallic minerals production by at least 100%. Decarbonization will also be a key driver in many raw material value chains. All this will have a huge impact on raw materials demand and in particular rare metals. Examples include cobalt for batteries, rare earths for windmills, or smartphones and silicon for photovoltaics.
So, according to Mr. Šefčovič, decarbonisation is going to be a key driver. Let's see what he has to say now about the EU's climate ambitions, also linked with the upcoming COP24 conference.
The EU stands by its commitment to the Paris Agreement and will make it very clear by the time of the climate conference COP24 in December. We will adopt an ambitious EU mid-century climate strategy before Katowice and set out the critical pathways to decarbonization. A competitive European industry, while reducing CO2 emissions, will be at the center of our 2050 plan. The Commission's industrial policy strategy stated clearly our ambition to lead simultaneously on three fronts: digitization, innovation, and decarbonization. To this end, the decarbonization agenda and the circular economy are natural allies. Beyond its advantages in terms of raw material savings and waste prevention, the circular economy is also a critical avenue to address the carbon footprint of our industry. More generally, the transition to a circular economy is a tremendous opportunity to transform our economy, making it more sustainable, while creating jobs and generating competitive advantages for Europe.
So the circular economy is a critical pillar to address the carbon footprint of our industry. Balancing on one hand, Mr. Šefčovič has just told us, competitiveness, on the other hand, climate ambition. That's something we'll discuss further in our two panels today. Let's see where he moves on next, touching very strongly, as we may expect from him, on batteries as well.
Like decarbonization, it is a means to an end, and our goal is to clean, energize, and modernize our economy. Both EU battery value chains and the circular economy, your two panels, are important dimensions of the EU strategy to ensure the secure and sustainable supply of raw materials and the competitiveness of our industry. The circular use rate of raw materials in the EU economy today is relatively low, below 10%. That is why the Commission has proposed measures for increased reuse, remanufacturing, recycling, as well as increased material efficiency, following up on the Circular Economy Action Plan of 2015. The growth potential of the circular economy is significant. Already in 2014, private investments in the EU circular economy sectors were estimated at 120 billion euros, which is equivalent of 0.8% of GDP, and increased by 58% since 2008.
Now, we've heard, obviously, from Vice President Šefčovič in the past about his passion for batteries, but it's nice to hear this coming out today as well, about the battery value chains and circular economy as being an essential part of the core EU strategy. But again, I'll be interested to see what our panelists have views on that when we in our panel on this afterwards. Let's continue to see what Vice President Šefčovič has got to say.
There were more than 4.5 million jobs in these sectors, an increase of 7% compared to 2008. Similarly, it has been estimated by EIT InnoEnergy that the EU market for batteries could amount to 250 billion euros from 2025 onwards, and that 4 or 5 million jobs could be created in this sector. To prevent a technological dependence on our competitors and capitalize on the jobs growth and investment potential of batteries, the Commission decided a year ago to launch the EU Battery Alliance. Its objective is to build a competitive manufacturing value chain in Europe with sustainable battery cells at its core. The Battery Alliance brings together under a single cooperative platform the European Commission, interested EU countries, the European Investment Bank, and key industrial stakeholders. In May this year, the Commission published, as a part of the third mobility package, the Strategic Action Plan on Batteries. Its measures aim at securing sustainable access to raw materials from resource-rich countries outside the European Union, encouraging more European sources and use of raw materials at a time when Asian countries are capturing some critical resources, addressing the shortage of processing and refining capacities for battery raw material in Europe, reusing and recycling in a circular economy of batteries, an area where our companies are leaders, investing strategically in research and innovation, and supporting manufacturing projects at scale. To put it schematically, we want the next generation of batteries to be produced and recycled in Europe. They must be safe, highly efficient, have a competitive price, and be produced in a sustainable way. That means produced with a sustainable sourcing of raw materials.
We want the next generation of batteries to be produced and to be recycled in Europe. I think that's also what many people here in this room, from an industry perspective, would also like to see as well. And let's see the final words from Vice President Šefčovič before we move on.
Minimal carbon footprint and a circular economy for batteries and raw materials. We need, for instance, to increase recovery of metals from portable batteries present in smartphones and electronic devices. And to conclude, raw materials, I do not need to convince the audience, are more than ever the lifeblood of the economy. There is no doubt that raw materials are key enablers of the Industrial Revolution. The European Commission has acknowledged the challenge of a secure and sustainable supply of raw materials. The scale and speed of this challenge calls for a coordinated approach involving all stakeholders. No actor can do it alone. Member States have a particular role to play, considering that mineral and mining policies are Member States' prerogatives. The leading position of Europe in high, value-added, low-carbon and sophisticated products and services relies, among other factors, on strong value chains.
I think we do too, thank you. We hope we have a rich discussion, especially building on the links between raw materials, recycling and decarbonisation in a circular way, of course. So now, as I mentioned, we want your views. You've heard from an industry perspective and a Eurometaux point of view. You've heard the words of Vice President Šefčovič. But I think it's important now, before we start any of our debates, that we have your views too. So back into Slido, everybody, please. And there's a question for you about how you're thinking and how confident you are in some of the messages that we've heard. We've heard a lot of strong claims there from Vice President Šefčovič, based on EU action and action plans. So how confident are you, ladies and gentlemen, that the EU can become a leader, in this case in battery raw materials, over the next decade? You've got some options there to choose from the more confident to less. So cast your votes, please. So I think an important note there then for our panelists that are about to take the stage as well, that I think a good half of our audience here still need to be convinced that the EU action is going to yield what we've heard it should or could. There's a degree of confidence in the room as well, though, for many, but still we've got work to do, and a number of people who are not confident, balanced by a few who are. So with this in mind and with this poll in mind, I'm now going to invite up to the stage our first panel on supplying raw materials for battery value chains, and how can we establish EU leadership that half of you feel we haven't got at the moment. So I'd like to call up Lowry Evans, Director General of DG Grow from the European Commission. If we could give a round of applause to them as they come up, please, ladies and gentlemen. Bringing an industry voice to our debate, I'd like to bring up Dennis Goffrau, Chief Technology Officer from Eurometaux. And then closing the loop of a wide range of different stakeholder views, I'd like to bring up Karen Hanghøj, CEO of EIT Raw Materials. And Julia Poliskanova, who's the Manager of Clean Vehicles from Transport and Environment. So just a little quick heads up for you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to do 4 stages here with this. Our panelists are very quickly going to give us their views in response to my questions. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion amongst our panelists from what they've heard from each other. And then, via Slido, we'll be going straight over to your questions. So when you're listening to the statements from our speakers, if you have questions or statements you want to pose to them, please use Slido to share those. The colleagues at Eurometaux at the back are collecting those and sending them to me so I can share them with the panelists on your behalf. And they'll be coming up on our screens too. So with that, and then we'll obviously open up with the microphones for a more traditional Q&A as well. So with that in mind then, Lowry, I'll come straight over to you to get things kicked off. How does the European Commission's Battery Action Plan aim to encourage new investments in domestic production and recycling? And what realistically can be achieved? And what's your time scale for this?
Okay.
I've got an easy start because I can build on what Maris has just told us.
Indeed.
So let me talk about the Battery Alliance, because concretely I think this is the biggest contributor so far, but it's not the only part of the story. So Maris was talking in a bit more general terms. The focus so far has been on the car industry. So we have one of the real big competitive successes of the European economy historically today has been the car industry. But against the decarbonisation agenda, against the technological shifts, there is this big move towards electric cars. And we have understood late that China has a massive lead, Japan has a lead, Korea has a lead. And that really matters in terms of batteries and battery cell production. Because the value added, a big chunk of the value added, the profits, if you like, the jobs of the present car industry is in the engines. Europe is good at engines. Europe is nowhere on the fuel cell. And if we are going to be good car manufacturers, we also need to have the supply chains. The jobs are in the supply chains as well. So this is the competitive challenge. So we're late into this party. So the Battery Alliance is about trying to facilitate the manufacturers getting their act together and getting the member states to act collectively to help them to do that. So we have a value chain story. We're trying to build a new globally competitive value chain from a standing start, and the others are already running. The Battery Alliance is 1 year old. I'm sure Denis is going to talk about some of the specifics, so I won't do that. And we have had a focus on investment from the very beginning. Maros said the European Investment Bank is in the room, for example. So the first thing that we have to hit is investment, like you say. The InnoEnergy people this week said to us that as of now, there is €100 billion investment in the pipeline. So it's significant already. So you need to have the investment pipeline before you can have the building, right? So the investment pipeline is improving weekly. We need, that's still a gap, so I would quantify that gap as 50 billion, just to give you an ordre de grandeur. So we have to crack that next 50 billion very, very, very short term now. This is mainly a private capital story. Denis can surely talk about that. But we have to leverage private capital with public capital. That's the member states' money, that's perhaps EIB, but we're on track, I would say. We're not there, but we're on track strategically. The recycling part of the story, you explicitly asked about that, I think is going to be about how do we get the raw materials on the scale that we need, and how do we get the value chain? How do we design this European-wide value chain from the beginning so that the use of these raw materials is sustainable, and that we get the recycling and reuse in this value chain that we're designing? We need to have those elements in place by, let me give you a number, 2023. Long way to go. We have a plan. We can go into it in more detail.
Okay, thanks very much, Lowry. Okay, Denis, I'll come over to you then. We've heard about big numbers, 100 billion in the pipeline, 50 billion coming, 2023 as a deadline. Gap to fill.
Yes.
Hopefully coming.
Yes.
And we've heard an acknowledgement that we've made a slow start in Europe on this. So from a Eurometaux perspective, how have you received the battery action plan? And what's your perception of Europe's chances to actually take leadership here in the coming years?
First of all, we welcome the energy and the enthusiasm of Vice President Šefčovič. I mean, he's a real engine for that development. We also welcome his pragmatism, because it's not about producing papers, whether they are policy papers or scientific papers. It's about building an industry, building plants, start piling. And we need to be realistic. The next generation can only be built on the existing generation. So the technology exists. It is lithium-ion. We know the metals that are needed for this technology. Sometimes the technology has to come from abroad because some countries, as Roy said, have built experience. It's mostly Japan, Korea, and China. These companies are investing in Europe as well, creating jobs in Europe. But Europe has a tremendous opportunity in terms of supply chain. because we have a lot of companies producing the raw materials, but also the metals. We have the potential to have mines in Europe, to have refineries in Europe, to make the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel that is needed, and then will be actually the functional material used in the battery. So that I see that as a great opportunity for Europe and the industry and Umicore. We are investing. We are developing this industry in Europe. Now, if you look at the supply chain, I mean, the theme is closing the raw material loops, and there is no doubt, and Umicore has been an advocate of the circular economy for many, many years, that on the long term, recycling will make a sustainable mobility, electric mobility possible. Now, the thing is that you can only recycle things that already exist, and the cars that are on the road today will still be on the road, I hope, in 10 years. So there is a gap, there is a delay in the availability, and also during the growth, by definition, you need to prime the pump, and you need to prime the pump with primary material. So I think there is a clear opportunity for Eurometaux and his members to support these primary supply of metals into the electrification story of Europe. One of the thing we also need to stress is the speed. Again, the CO2 regulation that are legislation which is produced by the European Union will require a lot of electric cars. These electric cars will need to be made with batteries, and it's tomorrow. And we need to build large plants, so move fast is definitely one of the thing we want to do. Maybe one point on the recycling. Again, there is some cobalt to be recycled, which is in the cell phones, in the portable electronics. Today, yearly, there is about 30,000 tons of cobalt that are used in these applications. And the recycling rates are extremely low, so this cobalt is lost. And with this cobalt, we could make millions of cars. So while for the full recycling, we'll need to wait for the cars to be at the end of their life, there is an opportunity already right now for Europe to recycle its own portable electronics and make the cobalt available. On the topic of recycling, an important point is also the dismantling and reverse logistics. I mean, you need to bring all these batteries from the retailers, from where the car ends its life, bring it back to the central recycling plants. You need to dismantle. So there is probably there also quite some work to be done in terms of research, in terms of and that there could be some also opportunities for small and medium enterprise to help in the recycling of batteries. So in a nutshell, we are pleased by the battery initiative. We are willing to play a role. We are committing large amount of investment to this industry, and it will happen in Europe. We are sure of that.
Great. If you've got one ask from the EU institutions, from member states, if there's one thing you feel that definitely really needs to be a point of focus yesterday, today, right now, what would it be?
I would stress on the speed of permitting, speed of making funds available when they are necessary to stimulate a quick reaction. Speed is of the essence.
So you feel that time to market in actioning these things is still a little too slow?
Yeah, I mean,
permitting is for sure too slow.
Yeah.
Let me say it.
That's a bit frustrating when you are ready, you have the money, you have the technology, and you still need to wait 6 to 9 months with an idle, it's a beautiful place where you are going to build your plant, but the permittings need to.
It'll allow me a reflection as well, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday and the day before, I was moderating an event here in Brussels in a similar industrial area, and we had a keynote speaker from China, one of China's top sustainability experts, and I think this also applies here. And she said to me, David, she said, you haven't even seen China's potential yet. We haven't even got started yet. So what you're saying is we need to be faster. And what I'm noting as well is the idea that the competition is already fast and getting faster.
Yes.
So then that, I suppose, makes the need to catch up even more of a challenge. And then the speed element comes in even stronger. Okay. So So Karen, I'll come over to you now. How does EIT Raw Materials perceive the battery action plan? And on the investment area, where should we be prioritizing our investments?
Thank you. I mean, there's been so many things said already by my fellow panelists, and also in the keynote that I think are really critically important. So EIT Raw Materials, just for those who might not know, is a partnership. It's a partnership of industry, universities, and research institutions in the field of raw materials. And so we are very happy about the Battery Alliance, and we have, of course, our partners are already very involved in the Battery Alliance. They're very strongly involved, especially many of our industry partners, but also our research partners and our universities. And I think from our perspective, what is so unique and so great about the Battery Alliance is actually that it's sort of the first time where we are addressing the entire value chain in one kind of package. So we are talking about that everything is important when we talk about battery production. Mining of the raw materials that go into mine. The processing is incredibly important, something that we definitely need to invest in Europe. And also, recycling is very, very important. So all those three things is something that Europe should focus on. It's something that we should be investing in. And it's also something where our partners can really contribute in a very good way, and where we perhaps also can act as a sort of a coordinating body in that context.
Okay. And from your side, again, a little bit like I asked to Dennis, if you could identify one element of this battery action plan where you feel still really it's not quite there, it's not doing what it should be. I'm going back to the fact that half of our audience didn't feel confident.
I do have a couple of jotted down notes here, because I think that Dennis just brought it up. I think it's very important to realize that we are talking about raw materials that are in huge increasing demand. So we can call it closing the loop all we want, but if we are going to increase, we saw in the keynote, if we're going to increase the demand by 1,000% over the next few decades, there is no way we can recycle our way out of that. So I think that we have to be also realistic, call a shovel for a shovel and a spade for a spade, and say we need the raw materials that go into these technologies. And when we talk about the recycling, as Dennis says, there is the stock is not there because the demand is increasing. The residence time is quite long, so we need to develop the technologies now, and we need to design for recycling in the future. And that is going to be very, very important, because these car batteries, they're huge. They're 300-400 kilograms or something like that. They need to be not deposited somewhere. They need to be recycled. So we need to be sort of on front of that, but we need to realize that we need to get raw materials into this loop that we want to close. We need to get them into the loop in a sustainable way, and we need to develop those technologies that get them into the loop and to make the advanced materials in Europe. And so in that context, I also do very sort of briefly want to say that one of the very important things that we also need to invest in Europe are the skills, the education. And that goes for battery raw materials, but it really goes for raw materials in general, and it goes for also how we use and consume and design the things that use raw materials in the future. Because the thing is, you mentioned as also, Dennis, there's cobalt in this. But what if the CO2 footprint of getting the cobalt out of this is bigger than the CO2 footprint of getting it out of rock? Which one do we choose? And how do we address those kind of questions and problems in the future? Because we're going to have them, not just with batteries, but with the wind technologies, with the solar technologies, all of these green technologies where we are increasing raw materials demand. Well, that was a bit long.
Oh, I think we always have to strike a balance between time and quality, don't we? Karen, to be honest with you, I think you tick the box there on the quality side. So bring it over to you, Julia, just to complete our round of everybody before we go to some audience questions via Slido. So look, transport and environment, I know you've recommended that the battery action plan focuses on, let me quote, high quality, safe and green batteries. Okay. So what do you think Europe's priority should be to get this sustainable battery value chain in Europe?
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for having Transport and Environment here. We are a sustainable transport group, working all things transport, and largely these days electrification, which is not possible without batteries, whether it's cars, trucks, shore, sea shipping, or other means. How do we make sustainable battery manufacturing here in Europe? There are many answers to that, and probably a few minutes is not enough to outline all of our views, and therefore I look forward to the discussion as well. We have to make sustainable sourcing of materials. Producing batteries here in Europe just on its own makes them greener because our electricity is better, our regulations on whether it's environment or labor are tighter. However, in my few minutes, I'd like to focus in particular on the issue of circularity and recyclability of materials. We're very happy as an environmental group to see that many players, in particular the Commission in their battery strategy, really acknowledges that this is not just a green policy. It is a really important pillar of ensuring security of supply. Once we actually spend environmental and economic capital into mining those sources and the minerals and having them here in Europe, we might as well keep them here and continue having them in our value chain. It can also help shave some peaks in prices as demand really rises and, for example, cobalt becomes really expensive. It won't solve the problem on its own, but it will help. Just to bring an interesting example from China, and I think we all agree that in this area, at least of lithium-ion batteries, China is leading today. Just this summer, a recyclability law was passed in China. And what was really interesting is to see how that country views that. For example, their plan is to recycle or recover around 66% of lithium by 2025 from batteries and 76% of cobalt. And the overall aim is to meet around 20% of Chinese demand for battery materials from secondary sources. This is massive. Chinese market is huge. And even their battery manufacturing has already overtaken Japan and South Korea last year. So they really see it as an economic opportunity, recyclability. And so should we here in Europe. There was a study done earlier this year by a German think tank, Agora, which looked into how much of our demand in Europe can recycling meet. And the results are quite promising, and it's only the beginning. At least 10% of all the demand we will have for cobalt, lithium, and nickel, we can actually meet from recycling those materials. It's not all, but it's helpful, and it certainly should be a big part of our policy. Today, our framework is not up for scratch to really unlock that potential and to use it. Just to name a few examples, I know we'll discuss it more, but the battery directive is really key here. It's no one's fault, but it's just the fact that the 2006 directive does not even have a category for lithium-ion batteries. They were not there back then, they were not big. So at the moment they just fall under generic category, and up to 50% of that by weight needs to be recycled. That's just not good enough. First of all, 50%, is it really all we can get? We know that companies like Eurometaux achieve 90% recovery rate for materials such as cobalt. So at least we should aim for best available technology. And secondly, doing it by weight really misses some of the key materials in a battery. What you can do, you can just recycle the metal carcass, which is heavy, and you're close to meeting your target. But some of the really important materials, such as lithium, are very light. So there's not even an incentive today to recycle them. So a lot of things there that we need to get right to reap full benefits of unlocking this market. Thank you.
Thank you. You've touched upon a couple of key points there, including also this issue of weight, which is sometimes seen, and many, I think, in the room can recognize, it can be a real barrier to achieving the recycling because it's commercially not viable to do as it stands. Okay, I'll open up to the whole panel now. If anybody has any particular comments that they want to add to what they've heard. As you mentioned, we've heard a lot of things already. Is there any reflections that you might have on what your other speakers have said? Lowry?
Yeah, you make a very good point that our regulatory environment also absolutely matters. So as we are setting up or helping industry, let's say it like this, setting up a globally competitive future value chain, we at the same time now need to think about what regulation needs to underpin that. Mm-hmm. And we are beginning to think through those issues as well. So you say about the battery directive, this is the core regulation in the area. We will have to open that up in the next commission. We have a little bit of time to think about it, but it will be opened up in the next commission. But already now, we need to be working, and we are working, on the design parameters for the batteries, the eco-design parameters for the batteries. So we do now intend by the summer of 2019 to come up with a proposal for an eco-design regulation in this area. And that's very important because we can then regulate in the way that fits what our industry is capable of doing, the sustainability parameters for the battery production. And that's really important, not just in terms of helping circularity and what you were talking about, but actually it's really important politically. Because our consumers, car consumers, will move to electric cars because they want to drive cleaner cars. So they will want to buy those cars. They will want to make their personal, the early movers will want to make their personal contributions to the decarbonization of the economy. And we will have to be sure that the batteries within those electric cars are also clean. There's a political deal here. So part of the credibility on the demand side is also to be sure that we have clean cars delivering the clean promises.
Yeah, maybe one comment. I really commend the pragmatism of the Chinese in defining clearly what is the most important, what are the scarce metals that they need to recycle and focus on first. And they mentioned about lithium and cobalt, which are definitely some of the most critical ones. You could add some. So it's more pragmatic in a way than just saying 50% of the weight, in which you can basically play a little bit the system. So I think it's this kind of regulation that we would welcome. It's obvious for Umicore that the clean mobility, the electrification needs to be clean from beginning to end. It's not only during use; it's also during production and recycling, and it will.
Karen, anything you want to
add? Yeah, I have just a brief comment on the concept of circularity, because it's very popular. You know, we all go to these talks and people they slam a green circle onto a slide, and we all think it looks really great, and we all support it because it's sustainable, which we also don't really know what it means. So we use the word circularity in a lot of different ways. And my new favorite slide, which unfortunately I can't show, is the title of a paper that was published last year by a group of researchers in Holland. And the title of the paper is an analysis and comparison of 114, and I'm not making it up, 114 definitions of circular economy. And so it is becoming one of these things that we say to make it sound really nice. And I think it's really important for us to realize that circular economy in itself is not the goal. The goal are the Plan 2050, it's the UN Sustainable Development Goals, it's making a better world, all those things. The circular economy is the means, it's the vehicle that we use. So it is more a way of thinking. We also don't talk about linear economy as a goal in itself or a value in itself or anything like that. So I really think that we need to also discuss and sort of realize that circular economy is a way that we start thinking about what we do in industries, in the world, in societies, in policy, but it's not in itself a goal.
I see. It's a clear point. So we're confusing sometimes process with output on circular economy.
It's the train that we're taking to a better world. 8 months. In mining, exploration and mining, it takes decades. So from the time we started looking for rare earth metals 10 years ago in Europe, and until today, did we open any mines? No, we didn't. Are we close to opening any mines? No, we're not. We may be closer than we were 10 years ago, but we're nowhere near close. So from the time that we are identifying something that is going to be a driver for us, and the time that we can actually secure a primary source, it is typically, in the best case scenario, maybe broader level, or what is always the issue here is the license to operate. That is very, very important, which we haven't had much. This is one of the reasons, of course, that a lot of heavy parts of this industry are shipped to other parts of the world and no longer in Europe. The downstream industries that need all the metals and all the materials we still have. Now we have this dichotomy of how